One of the projects I was not sure whether to include or not within this set of videos is the manipulation of an infrared image. Obviously, not many photographers would have access to a converted camera. But the techniques we need here are much the same as those we would apply to any monochrome conversion. And of course, infrared has an interest even to those who don't have an infrared camera. And who knows, I may inspire you to give it some thought, especially when we come to trade in our camera. We're offered so little for them these days. Well, there's the time to consider an infrared conversion. I do have a dedicated infrared video set available on my website. Just go to the digital photography section and you'll find it. So here I started with 8 portrait format images, all taken handheld. For those that do quite a bit of panoramic photography, they usually invest in a special gadget that fits on their tripod to make sure that as you pan around to take a series of photographs, they're all perfectly straight and lined up to get a really good and perfect stitch. Generally speaking, I think black and white is all about creating that rich contrast, but as long as the subject is suitable for that treatment, of course, and I think this one suits that pretty well. The trick is getting that impact without losing detail in important areas of highlight and shadow. So what I tend to do is to try to enhance what is good about the picture and maybe subdue what isn't. In Photoshop's bridge, I need to highlight all of the images I want to use. That slight magenta cast is caused by the filter that's placed over the sensor in the camera, which is part of the infrared conversion. It blocks visible light and it's a very dark red, and that's the result that we see. So when I hit the enter key, all of these images are going to be intercepted by camera raw, and we'll see the normal camera raw screen, but all of the thumbnails down the left hand side. First thing I need to do is to make sure I select them all on the left hand side, and I think the easiest way to do that is with the universal keystroke Control A. There you can see all of the thumbnails selected, so now whatever change I inflict on them, it's going to be placed within all of them. Now all 8 of these pictures were shot handheld, as I've said, so I'm not entirely sure if what I'm about to suggest is going to help the stitch process or not. Common sense says it probably should, so what I'm going to do first of all is to go to my lens corrections. I don't have to worry too much about chromatic aberration here because we're going to be working on a black and white image, but maybe the profile corrections are going to be useful to the stitch process. So I'm going to tick that and you'll see the pop in the image, but of course that's going to be applied to all of those images in the 8 I've got selected on the left hand side. If I go back to my basic tab, I'm not sure it's entirely necessary to do this now, but I'll do it anyway. I'm going to remove the saturation from the image because I'm going to make, as far as I can, a black and white with impact. Now we need to go to the top right of the film strip, use the little drop down box here and choose Merge to Panorama. We've got 3 options in the projection here, but I'm getting a warning message every time I use perspective which says Photoshop cannot do what I ask. I'm not entirely sure why that should be. I suspect that I've either got too much or too little overlap, or maybe I didn't get the picture shot level enough for it to actually work that option. But we can certainly choose between spherical and cylindrical, and when I select cylindrical, you can see a slight change. It looks like we're getting the image distorted because it's being made more into a panoramic here. So what you want to choose here is going to be a personal choice. I think I'll go with the default spherical because I think I like that sort of look. That panoramic look is what we're trying to achieve. Now we do have the opportunity here to untick the auto crop, but why would we want to do this? Well, in the past I've often used this option if the stitch has gone a little wrong and I've lost pixels at the top that I really wanted to retain, such as here. I would have liked to have had these filled with sky. But I can do that in Photoshop, possibly with Content Aware, if not the clone tool and or the healing brushes. So we've got a choice here, and there would be no risk because when we get this open in Photoshop we can always crop it there and we're going to get exactly the same thing. But let's look at the boundary warp here. I'm going to move this pretty quickly to the other side. And look what that does. It is stretching the corners and filling the frame. Now we need to take a look at this when we open the image up to make sure that there's no visible reaction to what we've just done. But my guess is it's much the same as removing the tick here and doing that change in Photoshop using Content Aware. So the next stage is simply to click to merge. We get asked to give this a name, and I'll do so, and you'll notice it's saving this as a digital negative which retains the raw file status. And what's happening now in the film strip on the left hand side is all of those images are being stitched together, and there we see our panorama for the first time at a decent size. And the first thing I've looked at is the horizon. Now this is really the time we need to take a close look at the image, because if the stitch process has failed and we don't think it's something we can recover from, now's the time to bug out and live to fight another day. What I'm going to do is to zoom in there, and you can see I've got a bit of a problem with the horizon along there, but I feel I could possibly fix that a little bit later on. It's not a great problem. If I scroll to the bottom left, I'm just looking at those areas that were dragged into the picture. Well, a little bit soft down there. Let's take a look on the right hand side. That looks better. Top right, that looks pretty good, and the top left looks pretty good. So hitting Control 0, I think I'm pretty happy with that. What I'm going to do next though is I'm going to click Done. Then I'm just going to open up my panorama. I'm not sure, to be honest, if all of these images that I still got in the film strip are using up the power of my computer, but it's not worth the risk, so I'm going to click Done, close all those down. I can go back into Bridge. Now I can see just my pano, so I can open that up into Camera Raw, and now we're going to do the normal things we would do with any other raw file. Now a couple of things I think are worth mentioning here is that one of the pluses that I've noticed with infrared photography is how tolerant it is of contrast in the image. So it always gives us a fairly low contrast picture, which is good because we can punch almost as much contrast into the image as we want. It's not always easy to go the other way. The other thing to mention is this isn't a typical infrared shot in that it doesn't contain any trees or grass or undergrowth which turns almost white. We don't have blue sky with fluffy white clouds where the blue goes almost black. So what we're doing here is using the low contrast, but we're going to have to put the contrast into the picture, which means we're going to have to be fairly aggressive with the sliders over on the right. I'm going to work this image in two sections. I'm going to work on the bottom half and then the top half. One of the things I do notice about this image is my horizons smack in the middle, and in normal circumstances I would avoid that like the plague. So I have looked and thought about doing a crop, maybe cropping the image so we push this up. I can't get it up to that sort of point because we lose most of the image, and I've tried or thought of doing something along this lines which brings that horizon down a little bit. But to be honest, there's something about it as it is that just seems to work to me. So I'm going to pursue the rest of the manipulation here just as it is. So let's go with the foreground first. I'm going to almost definitely need lots of clarity. Pushing that right up. That's made a tremendous difference here, but looking at the histogram at the top of the screen, maybe I can squeeze some whites into this just to give it a bit of sparkle. You can see how that affects that rolling water on the top of the wave there. If I go too far, you can see, if you look up at the histogram, you can see now we're starting to clip some of the white areas. But what white areas are we clipping? Are we clipping the areas that we want in the bottom half or in the top half, which doesn't matter because we can deal with that independently in a moment? Well, I'm going to suggest that it's probably in the top half, so I'm going to push this a little further than I would normally go, and I may even push the blacks down just a little bit, and I've got quite a bit of sparkle coming through in that bottom area, but I think I may even take it down a little more and just bring some detail through in strategic locations. Over on the left here, this big rock here is a little bit out of balance with the others, so I'm going to pick up my graduated filter because it's a shape I think we may be able to deal with that. Let's just bring it up there, or failing that, let me hit the delete key. Maybe I'll even go with the adjustment brush. Looking over here, I've got a little bit of exposure, so I could start to just bring the tones down here because I certainly want them to be quite dark in that bottom corner, and I'd like that rock, as you can see, to be more or less balanced with the others because it was looking a little bit pale. I think I'm reasonably happy with that. I'll have a look around and see if there's any other little areas near the edge which are bright and may need toning down. There's a water pool there which I want to lose. The bottom's going to be quite heavy. I think I'm more or less happy with that. I'm going to open this up into Photoshop. I'm going to be using my technique here where I'm using different smart object layers. I find this so much more controllable. For example, I want to bring through some of the lighter tones, but I'd like to bring them through in an area where I can decide where they're going to be seen. So if I go to my layers, right click to the right of the thumbnail, I'm going to make a new smart object. I'm going to open up just the bottom layer back into Photoshop. Now I want to bring up the highlights in the foreground, so I'm going to bring up the exposure a little bit. Actually, that looks quite nice. I'm going to click OK to that. What I'm doing here really is stretching the contrast a little more. As soon as that appears on screen, I'm going to select the top one and apply a mask. Because with black selected as my foreground colour, a basic soft edge brush, the flow rate, I'll take my flow rate down to about 10%, make my brush a little bigger. Now I can bring up some of the tones in just the areas I want. Now you can see those fingers of rock are almost pointing into the picture, so they would be good to raise the tone a little bit. Maybe I've got a little bit of darkness over here which maybe spoils the picture a little bit, so I can just raise it up just in the odd spot, just where I think it requires it. Quite dark up there, but we may be dealing with that with the sky in a moment, but let's get it to a state that we're happy with. And you can see what I'm doing here. I'm deciding exactly how much comes through and where. I don't want any over here, I don't think. Maybe a little bit there, but this I want to be slightly darker. I think the sea is pretty good, but if it needs just lifting a little bit to give a bit more sparkle, we can do that. And of course, because we're working with a smart object, it's quite easy for us to go back to our layers, double click, and if we felt we wanted to give a little bit more, we can eke it up, come back in and take a look. But I think for the sake of what we're doing here, I'm going to say I'm pretty happy with the bottom half of my image so far. Now I want to do quite a bit of work on the clouds, so at this point I will be saving this as a project. Having saved those layers, I've got that stored on my hard drive now. I'm going to go back to my layers because I want to amalgamate these two layers together, but I also need another smart object to take back into Camera Raw. So I'm going to right click and make a new smart object via copy, hold the control key, select the two top layers, right click and merge them. So if you like, I've put these in the bank saying I'm happy with my foreground, but what I want to do now is open this one up into Camera Raw again, double click, because I want to deal with the sky. Now to do that, I'm going to take off the blacks, the whites, double clicking these, resetting the exposure, and already the sky is looking pretty good. But I'd like a bit more impact. And maybe I could stretch the blacks and the whites to give it lots and lots of nice sparkle in the sky. The only part I'm not too happy with is this goes a little bit on the dark side, but we're going to be blending two layers together in a moment, so maybe we'll deal with that a little later. Take a good look at the sky. If you zoom in really tight, and we've gone up to almost 300%, if you've got a lot of noise, I don't seem to have very much. I shot this at 200 ISO, but I do quite often go into the detail tab and just add a little bit of luminance just to smooth out the noise. But looking at the image, the only part that I am not too keen on is the top. We seem to have a little bit of a shading here. I think that may have been something to do with my lens hood slipping around. Can you see that just there? But nothing significant. But what I was going to suggest we do here maybe is to put a gradient on the top, just to hold the top down a little bit darker than the rest, because we are working with a pretty good solid base, and if we've got a solid top as well, we're going to get a pretty good balance. I'm going to have a look at this by opening this up into Photoshop. As soon as it appears, I'll turn the top layer on and we'll apply a mask and use the gradient tool to bring the sky from one layer through this layer here. So there's the mask going on the top. So there's the foreground that we like. The sky that we like is beneath. When you work this way, we're never certain we've got the density of the two parts right until we see the two blended together. So pick up black as your foreground color. I'm going to use my gradient tool, set to foreground to transparent and the linear gradient. So I need to draw a line somewhere down here to at least give me the start of what I want, and there you can see it. And now we're getting that lovely sky through. But can we adjust that a little more? Well, we don't have to just live with what the gradient gave me. Of course, remember, I'm reasonably skillful at getting the gradient in the right place because I've done it a number of times. But if you don't get it in the right place, just reset your mask back to white, flood it with white, and you can have another go. But what I'm going to suggest here is maybe where the gradient came down, let me hold the shift key and just click the mask and we can turn it off. I'm just looking where the mask comes down and seeing what effect it's having on the image. And I was going to suggest that we may want to bring the mask back a little bit in this area here. But I'm not sure it's essential. But I will mention what I was about to, or what was in my mind. So if I've brought black down on the top of the mask, I can temper that in this area and other areas by switching to white and maybe even switching to my brush and keeping the flow rate low. So if I wanted to just alleviate the mask there, you can see the tones being lifted. And maybe when we start to get up here, if I wanted to do the same up here, I can do that. Now we would work much bigger, of course, and I would get the brush smaller, and it would take a little time just for me to move my brush down here and raise the tones. Not worrying at all if I get this wrong, of course, because I can switch to black and I can do any repairs that I want to make the edges look natural. but spend just a little time just going down the edge, just raising the tones gently and gradually. Make the picture as big as you need it, and just be patient, basically, is what I'm suggesting here. Now there you can see some of the effects of the infrared on the foliage, a little bit more than in other places. So we can bring that through if you want. You can see it gradually lightening. And we've got some detail here which may be nice to bring through. There you see it. And the trunk of the tree looks pretty good. But how much we do is going to be personal. There's another tip that I'm going to offer here. Sometimes when we're doing edges like this, we often see evidence of a halo. You could suggest, maybe I've got one just there. Now it's something I could possibly put right by switching to white and maybe fixing it that way. Beg your pardon, it needs black. But what I was going to suggest is, what I often do along those edges is to temper my mask, and in this case I would need white. I would make the brush very big so it bridges that area. I would take the flow rate down very low to start with, and I would just lift the tones around the edge. I hope you can see them just lifting. Now I can't go too far because I'm weakening the sky here, but what I'm doing, I'm making where the sky hits the land here a little bit more easy on the eye, because we did get quite aggressive with some of those sliders, and even along here you could do the same sort of thing. But it's looking pretty good, I think. Now let me bring my layers out on screen just for the moment. The one area I want to have a look at before I flatten these two together, and I've just saved this as Panorama Project 2. So anytime you're about to make a fundamental change and move on in a manipulation, that's probably a good time to save a project. But I'm going to go back to my mask. I've got white selected. I've got a soft edge brush, and I've got a 10% flow. I just want to see if I can just lift the blackness of that section of the sky, which I can, and you could do this with it enlarged a little more, just to so it's not so black, it just looks a little bit better. So at this point I'm happy to go to the top right and choose to flatten the image. The next job I'd like to do is to deal with that top edge there. Got a little bit of a shading along there, so I'm going to try and fix that. I'm going to go to my spot healing brush. Going to make a brush just about that size. I'm going to click, hold the shift key and click at the other end. Allow Photoshop to do its work. I need to look very carefully along there, but I think that's done a pretty good job. Now before I go any further, I think I need to do something with that horizon line. So let me get rid of my layers for the moment. I'm going to bring my rulers into play here. Control R will do that, and I'm going to drag from them a guide. So let's look at the guide here. If I zoom in a little bit, we're looking okay along there, but there we've got a little bit of a tilt up and we've got to do a little bit of work there. So how am I going to deal with that? Well, let's have a look at going to our layers, removing the lock, because I want to go back to my edit menu, top left of the screen, and choose free transform. When we choose free transform, from the top options we have the opportunity to warp it, and this enables me to move it up this, well, I think this is best demonstrated. Let me just drag this line down a little bit. It needs to come down at this end, I think. See it just leveling up nicely. So now I've got it more or less level up here. Maybe if I just bring this up down a little bit, sorry, and this one down a little bit, just jiggling here and there to bring that down nice and level. When I think I've got it about right, I'll hit the tick on the options bar, allow Photoshop to do its work. I'll hit Control R to get rid of the rulers and View, Clear Guides. So now I've got just a little bit in the middle there where I just need to do a tiny bit of work. I think I'm going to need to have a selection in place there, and I'm going to work between this point and this point. So what I'm going to do here is pick up my rectangular marquee tool to give myself a straight edge along there. So I need to go right along that horizon line, more or less. I'm looking at it along there, but of course it's slightly off along here. So we've got a selection made here. In fact, I think I'll move that up a little bit. I'm going to nudge it up with my arrow keys and to the right. That's okay. I've got it in place, I think. You can see what we've got to build up here. Somewhere in the middle, I think, is most of the work we've got to do. Now, remember when we make a selection, we're selecting inside this selection, so we need to inverse that. Control-Shift-I, or select inverse. So now we've got everything on the picture selected apart from that little slither of a selection. So we can use our tools down here. I think it would be a good idea if I hide that selection. I'm going to pick up my clone tool here, and I'm going to see about doing a little bit of cloning here, because I need to raise this up. And you can see that it's not the easiest job to do and not leave any evidence that we've been around. So what I think would be a good thing to do here, I'm going to go back to my history. You can see already, look, I've used the clone stamp that number of times. So I'm going to use that as a bit of a practice. I'm going to back off from that. I'm going to go here, I'm going to hit, I think I'll drag this down over the copy icon and make a copy. My selection is still in place. You can hit Control H and see it. So I'm just going to use this one as my test bed, so to speak. Now I've zoomed in a little bit because what we're doing here is pretty tricky actually. So I'm going to sample from that point there and paint along the horizon. That's the line we need to achieve. I think perhaps if we get more or less that line done first, and maybe if I take it from here, go further along here, and here we're getting a bit closer, so I'll peel off there. You can see where we're cloning from, that little plus sign. And I think let's bring that up a little bit. I'm just changing my clone source. Sorry about that, I hit the wrong key. Changing my clone source to that position just to come up to the rocks. And then the final part. I'm going to hit Control 0 because I doubt anyone would see that, but I think we may need to just touch it in one or two places. Maybe if I picked up the spot healing brush now, and maybe just adjusted the brush size down and just touched in anything along there that gives me any visual problem. And so far I think I'm reasonably happy with that. But I will admit I got just a little worried there for a moment. I thought, hang on, I don't think I'm going to be able to pull this off. It's going to show, but it actually doesn't. The only thing we lost a little dark line across the edge. But I don't think that is significant, and I think in the scheme of things we've got away with that pretty well. Looking at the image on screen like this, if I wanted to be super critical, I suppose we could go back into that center point and say that this section here is slightly lighter than this section here, and maybe this wave here should protrude a little bit more to the left. Well, let's pick up the clone stamp. let's pick that up and sample from that point. And what I'm going to do is drop the flow rate of my clone tool down to about 20 or 30%. I think I'll go to 20, so that as I come here, I can touch once, twice, and I can allow it to peter out. See, I'm giving it a bit of a blend into the left-hand side of the picture. And this light area here, well, if we pick up our burn tool, and I would suggest that's probably mid-tone, so we'll select mid-tone from the top. If you look up there, you've got an exposure of about 10%, so I'll drop this right the way down. 10% may even be a little heavy. No, it's going to be fine. So I'm just wiping my brush across there just to blend those two halves, and I think I can live with that. Now remember, we had two layers in the layers palette. We had a little bit of insurance in case that little fix we needed to do in the middle didn't come off. Well, it has, so I've blended those two layers together. So I'm going to do just a little more work here. Now I can see my image in its entirety. I'm going to do a bit of dodging and burning. I'm going to pick up my burn tool. Mid-tones is probably what I need, about 10% exposure. Just want to do something with the top of that rock. Never been entirely satisfied with that. The light areas right near the edge of my picture. Looking around the picture at other areas that may need just a touch around the edge. And there's a couple here. Hit the wrong button again. I'm using a graphics tablet, and it is possible from time to time your thumb presses against the rocker switch on the left hand or in the middle of the pen, and you can bring up sometimes little palettes that you didn't expect, but small price to pay for the convenience of using one of these. Much easier than a mouse. I'm going to switch to my burn tool and highlights. A little bit of brightness in the sky over there, looking at the exposure at 10%. Just a couple of little touches just to take the worst of that away. But I'd still like to make a little more of some of the lighter tones in the foreground here. So once again, back to the same location in the toolbox, dodge tool this time. Probably mid-tones, 10%, because the tones I'm looking at here, I don't think you would describe them as white. So I'm just going to raise some of these, just to bring our attention nicely into this area. And I made a bit of a feature of these in RAW, but I'm going to enhance that. Make sure I've got nice white breakers on the ocean. I hate to see them grey, or in a colour picture when people put too much colour in and they turn blue. Look terrible. Need to deal with those things. So there we have most of the work done. I think the final thing I would do with a picture like this is, given that we've got a very dark base, when we start to zoom in a lot, you'll find there are lots of little marks and distractions which could be taken away with the spot healing brush. Now I tend to do these, but then again I do get a little bit obsessed with getting the picture as clean as I possibly can. Now I've gone ahead and done a little spotting of some of the highlights down here. Lots of little white shells that are stuck in the crevices of the rock, and as soon as we start to really be aggressive with a monochrome, they do stand out like a sore thumb. So I've removed those. But once I've got the image to, I think, as far as I can take it, I'm pretty happy with this. I'm sure we'd all choose to do something slightly different, maybe a little bit more impact in the sky. I could do a bit of burning up here, but one of my recent favourites, especially with infrared and monochromes, is to, once I've taken the image as far as I think I can, I just take a look into the Nik black and white filters to see what else that can do for me. And quite often there's one or two filters there that just take this a stage further. Let me demonstrate by going to Filter, Nik Collection, Silver Effects Pro. These are free filters that you can download from the internet. Once it appears on screen, there's lots of them, but I'm going to shortcut this and take you to those that I know are going to work well. I've got all of the filters showing here, so I'm just going down to these two are my favourites, high structure harsh. Now when I select it, it's applied to the image, and I can compare, so I can show you that's where I took it to, that's where the Nick filter has taken it to, and I like the sparkle it's given my picture. Let's try the high structure smooth, and I like that one too. I think it's a toss-up over which one of these you would rather have, but I think our mood on the day would probably affect that, but I'm going to go for this one. I'm going to open this up to a finished image, and there we have the completed image.